Hello there and welcome. In the previous episode we started with our RTS game, we set up the camera to have this RTS angle, and we also made some basic unit movement. In this episode we want to start dealing with the selection of the units, because in any RTS game you only move the units that are selected. So we're going to be able to select multiple units or one single unit, and only the selected units are going to move when we click somewhere on the ground. So for this, we're going to start by creating some kind of selection manager. So we create a new object and we name it something like Unit Selection Manager. Then we need to create a script with the same name on this object. We can either do it by adding a component over here and creating the script like that, or we can just create the script over here and drag it on the selection manager. So we're going to create the script Unit Selection Manager. And because we don't have this script, it's going to be a new script, and we're going to create and add. The first thing we want to do inside this script is to make it into a singleton. So in order to make it into a singleton, we need to make sure that there will always only be one instance of this object. As we saw, we can have multiple units and each one will have a unit movement script. But for this Unit Selection Manager, we only want to have one script for the entire project. And because this is a singleton and there's only one copy of this script inside our project, we don't need to start guessing which one we want to access. So that's exactly the point of a singleton. So there is some kind of code that we always use for a singleton. We make it a public, static, and the name of our class, Unit Selection Manager, instance, and we have these getters and setters. And then inside the await method, we need to make sure that if there is another selection manager, it's going to get destroyed because we only want to make sure that we have one selection manager, right? Because it's a singleton. So if the instance is not null and the instance is not this one, then destroy this game object. Else, the instant is this instant. So this is just something we do when we create a singleton. We can also collapse this so we are not bothered with this code. Now we want to create two different lists. One list is going to keep a reference to all of the units in our game, and the other list is going to keep track of the selected units in our game. So over here, we create two lists. So this list will store all the units in our game, and this list will store all the selected units in our game. Now, before we continue with this manager, we're going to create another script that will basically add every unit that is created in our game into this list, right? Because this list keeps track of all of the units. So when we create a new unit, it should automatically be added into this list. So we're going to create a new script and we're going to name it unit. And this is a generic script that is going to sit on all of our units. So we're going to select all the units and we're going to drag this script on them. Of course, it will be wiser to just delete all of these units and then create a prefab out of one unit, and then all of these will get the same scripts. So we can simply create a new folder and name it prefabs, or we can be smarter and just create the resources folder, because later we're going to use the resources folder to instantiate these units. So resources, and we're going to drag our unit inside this folder, and now it became a prefab. We also want to add the unit script on this prefab, so we simply drag the unit script over here. And we also want to save all the changes. So now this prefab over here has this script, and the one that is inside the scene has this script. And now we can do the same and simply duplicate all of these units, or we can drag this prefab into the scene. So we're going to simply move them and create a bunch of different units. And that's all for now. So all of these units are simply a copy of this one prefab. Next, we're going to open our unit script, and inside we simply want to automatically add the unit into the all units list. So we're going to remove the update method, but we're going to keep the start method, because at the start of the game, well, not at the start of the game, but when this unit is first created, right? Start is called just before any of the update methods is called the first time. So when this unit script is going to be created, basically when we instantiate this unit, then it's going to call this start method, and then we're going to add it into the all units list. So for this, we're going to access our unit selection manager. And because it's a singleton, it can be easily done without any reference, right? We can simply specify it by its name. So unit selection manager instance, and then we're going to add it into the list. So we're going to find this list, all units list, add, and we're going to add this game object. And this game object is this unit. Now we also want to remove the unit from the all units list when it's destroyed. So we don't want to do this in a different place when the unit is destroyed. We can do it over here. For this, we're going to use the onDestroy method. And this built-in method will simply be called when this script is destroyed. So onDestroy, and inside we're basically going to do the opposite. We're going to remove it from the list. So we never touch this list in a different place. We simply add it when we first create the unit, and then we remove it from the list when this unit is destroyed. So if we click on our selection manager, we can see both of these lists inside the inspector, and right now they are empty. But if we run the game, all of these units are going to be added into this list, and we can see it in action if we run the game. So now we have all of these units inside this units list. Obviously, in the future, we're not just going to start the game with units. We're going to start the game without units, and we're going to build them like in any RTS game. We're going to require resources or money, and then we're going to use the UI to create these units, and they're going to be added into the list as soon as they're instantiated. Next, we want to deal with the actual selection of the units. So we're going to open our selection manager, obviously, because this is where all the selection is going to take place. And we're going to add the update method. And inside the update method, we basically want to shoot another raycast and check if the raycast is hitting a unit, and if it is hitting a unit, it means that we selected this unit. So it's very simple. Obviously later we're also going to have an option to have some kind of box selection that we drag over the screen, and all the units that are inside this box are going to be selected. But for now we simply want to click on a unit and make it selected. And because we're lazy, we're simply going to use our unit movement code that we have over here. We're going to copy all of this and we're going to paste it inside the selection manager, and we're simply going to change the code a bit. Right now we don't want to right click on the ground, we want to left click, right? Because when we select a unit, it should be with the left click. Of course, in your game, it can be whatever you want. Then we again shoot a raycast, and it should go from our camera. At the moment, we don't have a reference to the camera, that's why we see this error, but we're going to add it soon. And we also need to change the layer mask, because right now we don't want to check if we hit the ground, we want to check if we hit some kind of unit. So it's going to be a layer mask that is called clickable. It can be even a building, it can be a unit, so we're going to rename it to clickable. Obviously, we still don't have these references over here, that's why they're red, but we're going to add them in a moment. And of course, we are not interested in moving the agent. So now let's add these references. So over here at the top, we're going to add the references for the camera and for the clickable layer mask. So we're going to have the clickable layer mask so we can detect if we clicked on a unit or something that is selectable. We also created a ground layer mask because we are going to create some kind of ground marker when we click on the ground. And we also have a reference to the camera. So now inside the start method, we want to get the reference for the camera. And now we can see that all of these errors are gone. So over here, we basically check if we are hitting a clickable object. But if we're not clicking on a clickable object, then we're going to do something else. If we are not hitting a clickable object, then we're simply going to deselect all of the units, right? Because that's the way it works in RTS games. We usually click to select, but if we click on the ground or on something that is not selectable, then all the selected ones are unselected. So we're going to simply use a method named deselect all, and we're going to create this method in a moment. Over here, if we actually click on a clickable object, then we want to select this unit. So we're going to use the select, we can give it whatever name we want, select by clicking, because we're also going to have a method to select by a drag box, right? A selectable dragging box. But over here, we want to select by clicking, and there's a small difference between these methods. That's why we want to have both of them. So select by clicking, and inside we need to pass in the actual object that we clicked on. We simply say hit, collider, and game object, because we hit an object and then we want to get the collider of this object, and then we want to get the actual game object that we hit. So now we can generate both of these methods. We simply hover, show potential fixes, and generate method, and it will generate this method with the actual parameter that we have over here. So because we pass in a game object, it's going to receive a game object. And then we are going to do the same for the deselect all, generate method, and it created both of these methods over here. So at the moment, when we click anywhere, it's going to check if we hit a clickable object. And if it is, then it's going to call this method and it's going to pass in the actual game object, and then we can do something to this object. But if we're not hitting a clickable object, then it's going to deselect all the other units. So before we add more code and we make it a bit more complicated, we're going to deal with this method. So over here, we're going to add some code. First of all, we're going to call this method inside of this method, because before we actually select a unit, we want to deselect all the units that were selected before. Now, don't worry, we're going to have an option to select multiple units, but we're going to do it in a different way. So that's why we're going to call this method over here. And then we're simply going to add the unit to this unit selected list, right? Because this list contains a reference to all the selected units. So over here, we're going to simply unit selected, add, and we're going to add this game object. Now, just to be clear, we're going to rename this to unit and not game object. So unit, and to actually make the unit move and only this unit move, we're going to have a method that is going to enable the movement of the unit. So enable unit movement. Inside, we're going to pass two arguments. The first one will be the actual unit, and the second one will be a boolean whether we want to enable the unit movement or not, because it's not very smart to create two methods, enable unit movement and disable unit movement. It's just a waste of time and it's not an efficient way. We can create one method that is named enable unit movement and then just pass inside a boolean that will be false or true. And if it's true, it's going to enable the movement. If it's false, it's going to disable the movement. So we can have one method that does both things. So we're going to pass in inside true because we want to enable the movement when we select the unit. So true. And now we're going to generate this as well. So it's going to generate this method with these parameters over here. And of course, this is not a good name. We're going to name it something like trigger or should move. And then inside this method, all we need to do is go to our unit and basically enable the movement. So the way we're going to enable the movement is by enabling the movement script, right? This movement script that we created. So at the beginning, when the unit is first created, this unit movement will be disabled. But when we select the unit, we're simply going to enable the script. So we simply go to the unit, get component, and we look for this unit movement component, and we enable it according to this boolean. So if this boolean is true, like we have it over here, the script is going to be enabled. But in a different place, we're going to set it to be false, so the unit will not be movable. So the script will be disabled. And that's basically the way we're going to enable and disable the movement of the units. So before we continue with all the other methods and we add the option to select multiple units, we can check if this is working, because at the moment it should work. So because we are enabling the movement of the unit only when it's selected, it should not be enabled in the beginning, right? So we're going to go to our prefab and we're going to disable the unit movement script as a default. And we're going to see it on all of these units. So all of them have this disabled, right? So when a unit is first created, the movement is going to be disabled. So before we can check this out, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, inside of our selection manager, we need to comment out this part, because if we're going to run the game and this method is going to be called, then it's going to throw us this error because the method is still not implemented. So we basically did not add any kind of code. So let's just comment this out for now, or even just delete it. The other thing that we need to do is set both of these layers. So the ground layer we already have, ground, but the clickable layer is something that we still did not create. So let's go to the layers and create this layer, clickable. And then we're going to set the clickable to be clickable. And we also need to set our units to be clickable. So we select the unit prefab and we set it on the clickable layer. And now it should basically work. So when we select the unit, we're still not going to see it visually, right? But we're going to see it added into this unit selected list. So now let's run the game. And when we click on the ground, nothing moves, nothing is selected. But when we click on one of these units, we can see that it was added to this list. And now if I right click, it will only move this unit. So that's good. Now, because we're not done with all of the methods, if I select another unit, it will add it as well into this list, and both of them are going to move, but that's just because we're still not done with the methods. Remember, when we select a new character or a new unit, it should deselect all the other units, but we're still not done. So now that we see that we can move one unit, we also want to be able to select multiple units. So we basically want to be able to click on the first one and then click on the second one. But usually we need another key to let the game know that we are interested in selecting both of them and not only to select the second one and disable the first one. So we're going to use the shift key to be able to do this. We're going to select the first one, we're going to press on shift, and then we're going to be able to add more units into the overall selection. So over here, where we send the raycast, we're going to add a condition. If we're clicking and holding the left shift key, then we're going to use another method and we're going to select multiple units. So over here, if input get key left shift. So if we're holding the left shift key, then we're going to run a method that is named multi-select or multiple select, whatever you want to name it. And we're going to add this same game object into this method, and we're going to generate this method like we did with the other ones. Now, if we're not holding the left shift key, then we're going to simply run this select by clicking. Now we also want to add left shift as a condition when we're deselecting all the objects, because if we're holding the left shift key and we click on something that is not clickable, we don't want to deselect all the items. So over here, we're going to add an if statement and we're going to copy this part. But this time it's going to be if it's false. So we're going to add this exclamation mark over here, or you can simply do if it's false. Then we're going to deselect. Now, before we create this multi-select method that we have over here, we are going to create this deselect all method. So inside this deselect method, we're simply going to do selected unit. So this is the list of the selected units, and we're going to clear this list. So this will basically clear the list and there will be no selected units. But we also want to disable the movement of all the selected units. So we're going to loop over all this list before we clear it and disable the movement of these units. So for each in, of course, this list, we're going to call this method enable movement. And we're going to pass inside the unit and false this time because we want to disable the movement. So it's going to disable the movement of all the units inside this selected units list. And now my neighbor decided to start drilling, so it will be harder for me to record, but we're going to manage. Now we have this method done, and the next one is this multi-select method. So over here we need to check so now if the list does not contain the unit, it will add the unit into the list and it will enable its movement. But if it contains the unit, it will simply remove it from this list, right? Because usually if we try to select a unit that is selected, it will simply deselect it. That's the way it works in RTS games when we try to select multiple units. Now, before we test this out and see if it works, because we're basically done with this, we also want to take care of this ground marker. So we want to instantiate this marker on the ground where we click on the ground for the players to move. For now, it's going to be something simple, but eventually it's going to be some kind of animated arrow that shows the player where the units should move. So we're going to have another raycast, and basically we can do it over here, but because we don't want to do this with the left mouse button, rather with the right mouse button, we need to create another raycast. So we can simply copy all of this. It will still be inside the update method. We're going to paste this. So if we click on the right mouse button, then we're going to create a raycast, and we don't need all of this inside. And then we're going to check if we're clicking on the ground this time. So we check if we hit the ground, and if we hit the ground, we basically just take the ground marker and we set the position of the marker to be hit point, and then we simply make the game object active. But because we're going to add an animation to it later, we also want to make it disabled first and then active. So this is just a small trick that you do with animations. So of course we need to create this ground marker that we have over here. So we're simply going to create some kind of object. It can be a quad, right? Let's also disable this gizmos, and we're going to move it over here a bit. We're going to rotate it, so about 90 over here. It should simply be on the ground. And this is just some kind of placeholder for now. We're going to change this later into some kind of arrow. And all we need to do is click on the selection manager and drag this quad into the ground marker. We can also rename this to be ground marker. We can also disable it so it will not be visible until we actually click on the ground. The next thing we want to do before we test all of this out is to create some kind of selection indicator. So on our unit, we want to have some kind of indicator that lets the player know that the unit is selected. Again, for now it will be a placeholder, but later we're going to make it nicer. So we're going to remove these units because we only want to have this on our actual prefab. And we're going to add some kind of, let's say, cylinder. We're going to change the size a bit. So let's say 0.1 on the Y. We're going to position it at the bottom, and we're going to make the scale something like 2, 2, or even 1.5, 1.5. And we're going to rename this to be indicator. And then we're going to create some kind of material to give it a color. So new material. Unit selection indicator. We're going to drag it on this indicator and we're going to change it to be some kind of bright green color. Again, this is just a placeholder. Later, it's going to be some kind of animated halo or something like that. Of course, in your game, it can be the style that you want it to be. Now, in the beginning, it's going to be disabled. So let's disable it. And let's go into the script. And over here, we need to create a method to actually make it visible and invisible. So over here, let's create a method named something like trigger selection indicator. Then it should also receive the unit as an argument and also a trigger boolean. So the same way we have it over here, but this time it should not be should move. It should be something like is visible, right? Then all we need to do is go into our unit transform and we're going to find the child, well, the first child of this unit. So the first child will be this indicator, right? Because this is our unit and the first child is this indicator. So transform get child and we want the first child. So index 0, game object, set active, and we're going to set it to be active according to this boolean. So if it's true, it's going to be visible. If it's false, it's going to be invisible. Now we need to call this method in all of the places that we select the unit because it should make this indicator visible. So the first place will be over here when we select the unit. So we're going to call this method before we enable the movement. And inside, we're simply going to pass in the unit and make it true. Then we're going to copy this and we're going to find another method, this deselect all method. So here as well, after we disable the movement, we're also going to call this method, but this time it's going to be false because we want to hide the indicator. And another place is over here inside the multi-select. If we are selecting another unit, we're going to make it visible, but if we're not selecting it, then we're going to make it false. So we're basically hiding the indicator. Another thing that we want to do over here when we click on the ground to show the marker is to first check if there are even selected units, because if we simply click on the ground and there are no selected units, we should not show this ground marker. So over here we simply check and unit selected, so the list itself, if the count of this list is bigger than 0. So only if we have something inside this selected list, then we're going to show this ground marker. And of course we also want to hide it, so let's copy this. when we deselect all items and we simply click somewhere on the ground. So now, because we had made changes to the prefab, we need to go over here and apply the changes. So now our prefab has this indicator as well. And now we can duplicate this to a few more units. And everything should work. Let's just see. Okay, so let's run the game. And now if I click anywhere on the map, nothing happens. But if I left click on one of these units, it will show this indicator. And then I can also right click on the ground and it will move the player. And also if I left click again, it will deselect all the units. Then I can, of course, select other units. You can also see the ground marker over here. It's a bit unnoticeable. But if I select a unit and I click somewhere else, we can see this ground marker on the ground. Now, if I want to select multiple units, I simply select the first one and then I press and hold the left shift key, and then I can select more units and they will all move to the position that I'm clicking. And again, everything is working. I can select multiple units and move all of them. I can deselect, I can select one unit. So everything is working as intended. Of course, we also want to have the option to drag some kind of selection box over all of these units, because imagine if we have 50 different units, we don't want to start selecting all of them. It will take a lot of time, and in RTS games we have this option to have a selection box that we drag, and this is what we're going to do in the next episode. So that's all. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you're still not subscribed. You can leave me a like to help me with the algorithm, and of course you can ask me anything you want in the comment section. I will be happy to help you as much as I can, and I'll see you next time.